Okay, mathematicians, how are you today? We are going to work on absolute value. Now, I happen to think we need to remind you what absolute value is. So, absolute value is a number's distance from zero. So, I'm going to write absolute value here, just in case you don't remember. I believe that actually you learned about it in 6th grade, and you may not actually have talked about it since then. So, absolute value, that is the distance from zero. That's all they want to know. How far is your number from zero? Now, that means if I have a positive 4, how many steps does it take to get from 4 to 0? Now, distance is always positive, always positive. So I can never take negative steps. You can only take positive steps. So distance is always positive. So that's important to remember here. Right? So if I have a 4, how many steps will it take to get to 0? Well, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. It takes 4 steps. So the absolute value of 4 is 4. Now I show absolute value by these bars on either side of the number. Now what if I have -3? So what if I wanted to know the absolute value of -3? Well, what that means is I want to know what is the distance from -3 to 0. How many steps will I take? Now remember, steps always have to be positive. So let's look at what we have. We have 1, 2, 3. It took 3 steps. So the absolute value of -3 is a positive 3 because it's 3 steps away from 0. Now that is what you learned in 6th grade, but we're going to start applying that to some of our equations. So there are some steps here to remember as you start to solve these. First of all, you want to make sure the absolute value expression is isolated. In other words, you see this x with the absolute value signs? It has to be by itself. There can't be anything on the outside. Second, set the inside equal to both the positive and negative number from the other side of the equation. I'll show you what that means. Then you're going to solve both equations. Then you're going to write your answers as a solution set. X equals, and then we're going to use those little braces. I'll show you how to use those. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at number 1. The absolute value of x is isolated. There is nothing on the outside. So now I'm going to set the inside value, x, is equal to both the positive and the negative number on the other side of the equation. So x is equal to 2 and x is equal to -2. Then we're going to solve both equations. But look, they're already solved. So now we're going to say x is equal to, and we're going to put these numbers in braces. So I always put my negative number first and then my positive number. So the solution to number 1 is -2 and 2. Now let's go ahead and do number 2. Very similar. M can be -14 or it can be +14. And again, I don't need to solve anything here. So M is either -14 or +14. Okay, now it gets a little trickier. So let's go ahead and take a look at this third one. My absolute value is isolated. Nothing is on the outside. However, when I go to write the inside, I'm going to get 5z is equal to 40. But remember, we also have to do the negative. 5z is equal to -40. Now, my z is no longer isolated. So what I need to do is I'm going to use my one-step equations. If I have a 5z, I want to turn this into a 1 so I can isolate it. So I divide by 5. Whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. So now I have z is equal to 40 divided by 5, which is 8. On this one, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to divide by 5. That becomes a 1. -40 divided by 5 is going to be a -8. So my z can be either -8 or +8. Okay, let's go ahead and do one more here. Notice that I have a -7a in absolute value signs. There is nothing on the outside. So I'm going to set them equal to positive 28 and negative 28. I'm going to solve, so I will divide by negative 7. That becomes a 1. Divide by negative 7. A becomes negative 4. Again, divide by negative 7 on both sides. And this time A becomes negative 28 divided by negative 7 is a positive 4. So A is equal to negative 4 and positive 4. Now, you will have to get a little bit more complicated. In fact, I'll do one more here, and then I'll show you a couple on the back side. Okay, so here I have D plus 1 equals 8. Now I have to rewrite it with a negative, so D plus 1 equals negative 8. Now I still have to isolate D, so I need to make this a 0, so I'm going to subtract 1, and I get D equals 7. Now here, this time I'm going to subtract 1 to make a 0. Subtract 1. And I get D equals negative 9. See, very different answers. So D can be either negative 9 or a positive 7. Okay, now let's take a look at the back side, because sometimes your absolute value will have something out on the outside. Now, if you have something on the outside, you still have to isolate the absolute value first. So we're going to do that here. We have 6 times the absolute value of x equals 24. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of that 6. Now remember, we get rid of that, because this is multiplication, by dividing. Remember, turn it into a 1. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So now I have the absolute value of x is equal to 4. Now I get to solve it like an absolute value problem. I have x equals positive 4, and I have x equals negative 4. So my solutions for x for this variable are negative 4 and positive 4. Let's do one more. Let's go ahead and do this one. Number 14 is kind of complicated. So notice that my absolute value signs are right here in the middle. So that's what I'm going to leave. But I've got to remove everything on the outside. So notice that I have a negative 3. That's my constant. Notice that's the coefficient. This is the constant. To move the constant, I have to make a 0. So I'm going to add 3. That becomes 0. I'm going to add 3. And now I'm going to rewrite the problem. I have a negative 10 times the absolute value of h plus 5 equals negative 80. Now I still can't deal with the absolute value because there is a negative 10 on the outside and it's being multiplied. So I'm going to turn it into a negative 1 because that's my coefficient. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other, negative 10. So I'm going to rewrite again, and I get the absolute value of h plus 5 equals negative 80 divided by negative 10 is a positive 8. Okay, we're getting closer to the end here. One more step. I have h plus 5 equals 8, and I have h plus 5 equals negative 8. Remember, set one to positive, set one to negative. Now, I'm going to subtract 5, and I get h is 8 minus 5, 3. Here I've got to subtract 5 again, subtract 5, and I get h equals negative 13. So I'm out of space. I'm just going to write it down here. H equals negative 13 or a positive 3. They get tricky. I promise you there won't be any ones like 15 or 16 on the practice. Just make sure you know how to do these. Okay, you may do 5 more of your own on this page or go ahead and jump into Delta Math.